In this video, we're going to talk about the determinants of the price elasticity of demand, what shapes them, and then we're going to introduce the other elasticities. The one summary video walks through all of those in very brief detail, and we're going to talk a little bit more just about some of the intuition. So some of this will be repetitive. Now, in terms of price elasticity, right, we're just thinking about how much consumer demand responds, their quantity demanded responds to a change in price. And so what matters is basically how much we care. So one thing we talked about is that, for example, low prices tend to be associated with lower elasticity because we don't spend a lot of our money on the good, and that tends to be across the board. I'm going to be very price sensitive on a house. A 10% increase in housing prices is massive for me. It's very different than a 10% increase in the price of disposable pens. It's just not a big share of my income. What also matters is whether or not there are close substitutes available. So, for example, our anti-venom was the sort of thing where there might not be any close substitutes. And so as a result, we really need that anti-venom. There's not a great alternative. An example counter to that is something like acetaminophen, which is the kind of proper name for Tylenol or paracetamol, depending on where you're living. Whether you call it the CVS brand of acetaminophen, whether you call it paracetamol, whether you call it Tylenol, they are chemically identical. And so the fact that there are many substitutes means that if Tylenol raises its price of its pills, you might just switch to the generic brand because they are literally equivalent. And so when there are more close substitutes, that means that people are more elastic because they have somewhere to go. Now, it doesn't have to be an exactly identical item. It could be the case that if the price of tacos go up, people spend more money on hamburgers and they shift away. But it depends on what substitutes are available. It also depends on whether things are a necessity or a luxury. And this can be, certain things like water is just a necessity. It's not really about consumer preference, but it also can be about how we prefer and think about things, right? Whereas a television might have been considered a luxury in the 1950s, today we actually consider that a little bit closer to a necessity, or at least we did until smartphones kind of messed up everything. But certainly as technology changes, that can change our perceptions of what are necessities and what are luxuries. And also in our own lives, we may have different preferences, right? In my world, cheese is not a luxury. Cheese is a necessity, especially delicious cheese. I consider coffee to be a necessity. Other people may not. The other thing that matters is the length of time since the price change. The best way to think about this is in something like gasoline prices. When gasoline prices spike really quickly, there's not a lot of things you can do to respond to that except to reduce your discretionary driving, right? So maybe it's not the year to take a road trip across the United States. But the bigger changes you could take that would affect your gasoline usage as a result of the high prices would be things like purchasing a more economical car, thinking about electric vehicles or hybrids, maybe switching from a car to an electric bike or a motorcycle or a scooter, walking, maybe moving closer to your workplace, maybe finding a job closer to home, considering remote work. All of those options take time. And so if you have a sudden shock, people are going to be inelastic because there aren't a lot of options they can implement immediately. But over the long run, people are going to become more elastic because all of those options become on the table. And so we would expect that if prices for gasoline are high for a very long period of time, people's elasticity would increase as people find other ways to cope with that. To give you a sense of just, what are these numbers, right? We've been using some kind of random examples just for the sake of working through things. I was curious, so I pulled some up. So eggs, they're not quite 0.1, they're about 0.32. One thing, they're a small part of our budget. We tend to think of them as a necessity. Milk, we're a little bit more elastic on it, but there's not a lot of substitutes. There are non-milk, sort of non-dairy equivalents, and that's been changing. But in general, people who want milk want milk. Soft drinks are something we don't really think of as a necessity, but they're just not a big part of our budget. The long-run demand for gasoline is very inelastic. And then these are things that tend to be much more elastic, right? Here we have lots of substitutes. If the price of foreign travel goes up, you might travel domestically. If the price of airline travel goes up, you might drive or camp or stay home. Restaurant meals versus cooking out. We have a lot more options here than we do in the other ones. And so these are things that are going to influence our elasticity. So here's another example for us to work through. There was a city in Indiana in 2020 that was thinking of tripling its ambulance fees to avoid losing money. And as you imagine, this was not very popular. People don't like the idea of the price of an ambulance ride going up, because ambulances are things that we tend to need at some of the worst parts of our lives. Sometimes the best, having babies, but often the worst. And so, this tripling of the price is not something that was very well received in this town. But the question here is, they're trying to triple the fees and not lose money. They're making an assumption about elasticity, and they're making an assumption about the quantity demanded. Specifically, what they're assuming is that demand for ambulance rides is fairly inelastic. Because if it was fairly elastic, tripling the ambulance fees, everyone would just find another way. Take an Uber, take a cab, maybe there's a private ambulance service in the area. So they're expecting, certainly there's going to be a change in the quantity demanded, but we're expecting to see a decrease, and probably a small decrease, reflecting the fact that this is in very inelastic good. If you are very eagle-eyed, you notice that I kind of cut corners and I just wrote demand. We're going to always remember, these are not shifts, these are quantity demanded. Similarly, we've also seen people take Ubers to avoid ambulance fees. What would we think would happen here to the price elasticity of demand? We're basically offering another substitute. Now, it's not a perfect substitute. There are some situations where an Uber would completely serve your purpose. If you sprained an ankle and were alone and couldn't drive yourself to the hospital, then an Uber would serve as well as an ambulance. But if something more serious had happened, you really need the life support that's available within a medical vehicle. So we would expect, though, that it would lead to some substitution. So we would increase the elasticity. Basically, we're offering more substitutes.